looking at it from the perspective of Kathy Dannemiller. There's a nice video that Ron did that kind of goes through and interviews Kathy and others and so forth. So we've got a few sponsors here today for our Big Change webinar. We've got the Master Organization Development Program, which is a part of my class that I'm getting to teach, and I love teaching, and our students are meeting this weekend, and this is a part of that experience. The Change Handbook, which inspired my work around collaborative change in the world and the Nexus for Change as an organization. And we've got Ron here with Fenwick Koller. And Ron, you want to say hi and a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ron Koller, and actually I was an intern for Kathy Dannemiller the year before Richmond Savings, which was 93 to 94. And then if you see at the very end of the video, in the aqua sweatshirts, Kathy was there, Stosh was there, and then the handsome Greek guy with a thick bushy mustache is one of my best friends, Jim Manilakis. And so I've been talking to him the last 2 days because he was there, and actually I had taken a job to get some experience out of college, and I was actually working on a big American Express tech job that Steve and I were talking about yesterday while this was happening.
Well, thanks, Ron. Thanks for making the time today. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so we're going to jump in to the discussion. So I'm shifting over, and let's jump into discussing the case. I love this. I honestly, Ron, I don't know how many times you've watched it. I've watched it 100 or more times, maybe 200 times. I can't tell you how many times I've watched it. I learn something every time from watching it. And every time I do an event, I come back and watch it, I understand a little bit more of what it takes to prepare for an event like this, to actually hold the event like this, and then what happens afterwards and how to manage that. And you and I have that article, the Change Formula article, the DVFS, and we added the S, and we talk about the history of the change formula from way back when. And a lot of that is connected into what this event is all about. So why don't you give us a little bit from your perspective on the notion of how these events are transformative as opposed to being maybe punctuated in a small change, but really kind of changing the DNA of an organization, and in some ways maybe not changing the DNA, but everything around it. When I look at transformation here, and I'll kind of explain this, Ron, to get your reaction to it, a caterpillar crawls and eats leaves. So its nourishment or its resources or its income are the leaves, and its mode of delivery and getting around is crawling. And then it goes into a cocoon, transforms into a butterfly that flies, no longer crawls, and eats pollen, no longer leaves. And so it's a dramatic shift in both the mode of its operation as well as what it takes in, yet it's still the same being. And in one sense, I said it's changing the DNA. The DNA, in a sense, maybe even stays the same, but there's a dramatic change. Could you speak a little bit to your experience around this event and how transformative types of events you've seen like this are?
Well, I think the interesting thing in what I learned at my years at Dannemiller Tyson Associates, and I'm being fortunate enough to work for and with Kathy and co-author the whole scale books with her, is while everybody gets or was caught up in the in the excitement of large group events, if you will, that was what I call that's a practice versus there's the principles that underlie the practice. And so while I don't nearly do as many large group meetings anymore, I still consider the work I do as whole scale change work, even the work that I'm doing with you right now, Steve. And you've heard me mention the principle, for example, when everyone knows what everyone knows, we'll be ready to move, or we'll be ready to shift. And that's where I'm an NT, so this whole unleashing the magic really bothered me. I'm like, oh, dear God, unleashing the magic. I was more like, we're tapping the potential of the organization, or, something more heady. And to tell you the truth, Kathy definitely espoused that magic. And you could feel it when you were in a room with her and doing this kind of work. And once I started embodying what she did afterwards, you just get that sense when you're using these principles, she used to say, trust the process before. To me, it's trust the principles. And that's all I have to say about that.
And yeah, and Ron, and what I would say and add to that is the notion of paradigm shift, and the idea that it's palpable in the room, and there might be multiple shifts, but there is a shift, and there is a moment when you can feel the energy in the room shift, and you know it when you see it. And it happened probably in Richmond Savings, not only in one moment, but probably in a couple moments at different points in time, including the last moment.
I think that's a great point, Steve, because the only thing that makes a paradigm shift like that is if you're utilizing the principles. And if you don't, which is unfortunate, all the change management methodologies from the past 10 or 15 years, you don't hear that term anymore. You don't hear paradigm shift. Why? Because if you have practices, and just call them change practices or change management or change leadership or whatever you want to call it, if you're just using a project management methodology, you're not going to get a paradigm shift. And so what happens? They just stop talking about it.
Yeah, yeah. And so as you all are out there listening to us chat, you probably have questions. And in the chat room, please go over there. So if you haven't opened up a window, open up a browser window and go to tinyurl.com/Steve Cady webinar. And in there you can ask some questions and talk with each other and tell us what brought you to the webinar and those kinds of things. We'd be curious about that. And so Ron, as you're looking, you might see a couple comments in there, or John, you might see, and just kind of interrupt as we go, or in the chat room on the GoToWebinar control panel. So with that, we're looking at Richmond Savings. And the notion of a paradigm also means, Ron, that once you have an experience or you have this awareness, you can no longer go back to what you were before. So it's once you see it, once you get it, you can't unget it. Have you seen that, kind of in the terms of Richmond Savings, how does that impact that organization? When they get it, they can't go back and be what they were before.
Well, to me, it's interesting because since that experience and learning that from Kathy, I've had several other interesting experiences like that. One that comes to mind was BASF, where when we were called in, the main client was he was having a lot of problems and people weren't connecting with him at all. And he was very gruff and very much of a thinker and didn't care about feelings and emotions, etc. And then there was also a woman that was in that organization that she embodied the heart. And I remember after we went through that work I did with Kathy Church, who was another Dana Miller partner, and when we were finished with that work, I remember the guy, shaking my hand and saying, I didn't like you guys when you first got here, and I didn't really think what you were going to do was going to work, but I must say, after 3 months, our numbers have turned around, and I'm not having as many problems, et cetera, et cetera. So he got what he wanted. And then the person who embodied the heart, she said that she had been there forever, and she was crying as she's driving into work. And she said for the first time in a long time, she loves driving to work now. And that was Kathy. That was Kathy's one brain, one heart. That's where the shifts happen, is not just one type of shift, but shifts that touched different personality types and different personas.
That is really, really a good point. And when we look at blended events, and this event here is a method event. A method event is using whole scale and all the principles in Kathy's approach, whole scale change, to facilitate this event and make it happen. There are also blended events, and that's kind of where we are today, as opposed to way back in the 1990s, where a lot of the methods in the large group events were focused on future search or whole scale and open space and so forth. And so people have these activities that are in the methodologies, like telling our stories. And sometimes they get blended together into an experience, like telling our stories with maybe an appreciative interview or something like that. And then you can get these blended events now where they blend whole scale and future search and so forth. What we're focusing on today is not a blended event, but we're looking at the activities that create the experience that created a collaborative event for Richmond Savings. And we're really focusing on the role of whole scale change. Ron, did you want to speak at all to any of the notions of blend, knowing that we're staying focused on whole scale and its effect on Richmond?
No, I mean, I definitely relate to this more because imagine using the principles in an organization where you can't get everybody in the same room at the same time. Well, guess what? You can use some of the technical tools out there as long as you use the principles. And Steve, you and I are doing that right now, and it is it's a big shift. I mean, that was the charge that Kathy sort of put to me, was how are you going to take this, kick this can further down the road? And that's definitely one area where I feel that I've done her proud. And so I'm very passionate about this blended part of it. The technology, the tools are so misused out there. Even this one we're using right now, GoToWebinar. It just frustrates me, but it's nonetheless, I think it's super important.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks. And so when we look at Richmond Savings, there's the event. This is not it was an event that was comprised of a series of experiences that were created by a series of activities using the whole scale principles. In order to create the event, there was a before the event, the during the event, and after the event. And in addition to that, when you look at the event, the before, during, and after, there is the anticipating of an event, and there is the leveraging after the event. And so could you speak a little bit to how you think of the flow? This is my way of thinking about kind of what happened. Could you speak a little bit to your thoughts on just the general flow?
Well, to me, it's when do you get feedback and or input from what I call change recipients, which is most of the organization, and it is also the people who are shut out of any kind of change management planning these days. The change agents and the leaders, we seem to have reverted back to our locking ourselves in a room and then telling people what's going to happen as it's happening. The flow that I like about here was Richmond in particular had tried to achieve these same kinds of goals. And so what you call, I mean, that was, in this case, it was a year, maybe 2 years. There was constant stops and starts and things weren't going well. And then they got Kathy and Stosh involved. And it's about getting the organization ready to shift. So while a lot of people see, and the most tangible, visible thing is the event planning, if you will, there's a lot of other pieces of what needs to happen after that you need to start thinking about planning for, moving on before, so that when the shift happens and people's hopes and expectations are up, that you have the plan, the wherewithal to make that happen. To me, Steve, that's your addition of S to the DVF model.
Yeah, and that's what came about. I'd sit there with Kathy and talk about the change roadmaps and that kind of stuff. And while she challenged us to kick the can down the road, she really had a hard time with thinking you could pin down a long-term change roadmap and kind of think about all the stuff that goes into and all these multiple events and all that kind of stuff. And again, that will be for later conversation. And I think the point here that you're saying is you got an event, you got to be anticipating the event, and you got to do things that create the conditions for actually the before the event is actually the planning of the event, yet there's stuff that happens before it. There's the consulting team. There is the organization. There are all these kinds of things that are happening, and you got to be anticipating the before, during, and after, and then you got to be anticipating the leveraging that goes on after the of the event, and so there's a whole lot of stuff that happens here in the process. And with Richmond Savings, it was a really pretty great design in my opinion. And the reason it was such a great design in my mind was that it was done to meet the unique logistic needs of the organization, because in the design process, the before, they addressed the three questions: what's the purpose, who needs to be involved, what conversations need to take place. Could you speak a little bit to what the typical process in terms of planning the before stuff? So we were done with anticipating, we're in the before of the event, and these three questions and sort of your thoughts on how you utilize this and how it might have been done during this particular case.
Well, what happens is, as soon as leadership or management says we want to get people's input, so if it's a large group meeting, if it's a survey, if it is a town hall meeting, any kind of place where hopes and expectations start to rise, if you don't match the expectations in terms of having some kind of progress, not change, progress. If people aren't benefiting, if things aren't quote unquote better, and when I say better, again, there's three main perspectives. There's the leader's perspective, there's the change agent perspective, and there's the change recipient perspective. And what I really, really like about Richmond Savings was that the original goals were from a leader perspective, and change agents by default generally yield to the leaders. So the change agents and leaders were in that camp. For a couple of years, they were working with consultants and working with people trying to get those goals achieved. But it really happened. And to me, I'm not a touchy-feely guy. So yeah, I'm happy that people are happier. But to me, it was the results. They got the good business results. And you'll see that second, the rewording of the goals, they were reworded in such a way that they spoke to the change recipient. They spoke to the people whose behavior is going to determine whether or not these goals are going to be successful and this strategy is going to be successful. So the original way that they worded it, and if you were to just look at the two side by side, you could say, man, they're really not that different. There's not that much of a substantive difference, but I tell you what, the difference, it made all the difference, those wording changes. Why? Because this is how we, the change recipient, view this.
Yep, and I'm showing the two right now on the screen.
Hey, this is John. Ron, I really appreciate the way you just broke that up, specifically how you said change recipient, change agent, and the leaders, and then describing the differences between the goals and how it impacts. It gave me a new lens. I don't often explain it that way, and so I just wanted to say thanks, really.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've been using that a lot lately. Unfortunately, the Wiley online textbook wasn't going to go, but that's part of that chapter. Is we've got a nice Venn diagram that introduces that. But it was actually from a book called Change Management and Action Oriented Toolkit by a number of great Canadian researchers, and they were just looking at change agents and leaders and change recipients as just sort of two big groups. And my experience was, as I looked at that, it's really three. And Steve will tell you too, as I've started to continue to develop that and refine it, it's working. It's like a new chapter in Kathy's work.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Yeah, keep it up.
Yeah. And how's any questions or comments out there in chat land, or anybody from our audience? Do you all see any comments yet or questions?
I didn't see any, but let's just open it up. And if you guys have any reactions to what you're hearing or questions, put them in there.
Great. And so then I talked about before, and then in the power of the three questions. I think the key thing here is that, when you bring a group of people together to plan the event, these are the three driving questions that you can ask. And there's other things that go on with this, and I would add. But essentially, getting clear about purpose and outcomes, and that's what you talked about, Ron, in terms of what are the benefits, what are the results, what are they going to achieve. And there's heart outcomes and there's head outcomes. and then who needs to be involved, and thinking about that circle of people to involve and engage in the process. I typically think, Ron, that there's three kinds of people for an event you got to think about. There are those people that need to be in the room. There are those people that you need to hear from while you're in the room. And then there are the people that you need to, like leaders that need to be involved but can't be at every table. And one of the acronyms that I think works well when I think about the who needs to be involved is the Agile Project Management RACI formula, R-A-C-I, which is you start out with who's responsible, and responsible in terms of the event would be all the people that need to be participating at the table that are responsible for the organization succeeding. And then accountable would be leaders. Who are the leaders that need to be in the room, can't be at all the tables, but they need to hear from and touch and be a part of and engage with. And then that's the accountable. And C is consult with, and those are the experts. That might be some particular people. And you'll remember in Richmond Savings, they brought in an expert to talk about the trends and so forth. And so they brought an expert in to hear from. That can't be at every table, but they need to hear from. And then last is I, is informed. And in this case, it's who do they need to hear from that can't be at every table. It's not necessarily the expert. And this is like the customer coming in, but can't be at every table. So there are the responsible to everybody, the A's and leaders, and then you got to have experts, and then you got to have other people that you need to hear from. And that's the who, and you kind of think of different categories. And then second is you need to think of a diversity, and think of how people are sitting at tables in terms of how diverse they are, as well as a variety of other things. Last is the agenda, and we'll talk about that. And you've got to really, I'm going to turn it over to you with your slides to kind of maybe give a high-level overview of that. But before we go there, do you have any comments you want to add in regard to purpose and who needs to be involved?
I mean, I think again you've moved it further down. Kathy's thing that she always used to say, Ron Lippett would say, tattoo who needs to be in the room on one wrist and what conversations need to take place on the other. And obviously purpose was in just about everything she's done, and so your acronym here works well, and I think she'd like it.
Cool. All right, so during the event, we've got the DVFS. Could you just talk a little bit about how DVFS, and we added the S, and Kathy operated from the DVF, and there's a change formula. If you all want to know, you can go search Google on the change formula by myself and Ron and John and and Jake Jacobs. It's in the ODP, Organization Development Practitioner, and it gives a whole history of this from way back from Ought to Be Little and how it's been used around the world. Could you speak a little bit to the change formula, the overall framework for the event, and I can turn over to your slides so you can talk a little bit more about the design of this event and give us a little behind the scenes look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think again that the three main groups, if you look at that lens again, if you look at DVFS, often, especially these days, you hear case for change. What's the business case for change? And that's also known as dissatisfaction, because the case for change is if you're content with where you're at right now, you're not going to change. So here's why you need to change. And it is almost exclusively done now from the leader perspective. And unfortunately, us change agents are guilty of, we're the ones that are producing it. So we're producing the business case for change, and we're pitching it to the leaders. And between change agents and leaders, we are figuring out, okay, here's the business case for change, and it does not include the change recipient's dissatisfaction at all. And Kathy was really big on, she would say, it needs to be a shared dissatisfaction. The dissatisfaction that you experience, I experience, everybody experiences. And that, to me, is, again, it's a timeless principle that we've gotten away from. And as I think about the leaders, change agents, change recipients viewpoint, I really think that case for change and dissatisfaction is a lesson that we could all relearn again in 2015.
And in terms of the agenda for the event and how it unfolded, it was 2 days with half the bank, 2 days with the other half the bank. They worked on Saturday, the leadership team worked on Saturday to rewrite the strategy, and then on Sunday, they came in and presented it and did their third day with everybody together. The interesting things here that are that from what I was told is in Canada, that you cannot be required to go to work on Sundays. For certain, I'm sure there's certain others you can, but in general, you can't be required to go to work. So it was voluntary for all the employees to come up, and they only had 5 people that did not show up on Sunday after they did their first bit of work. And from what I can see is what they did in their first 2 days in the agenda, they worked on the dissatisfaction, they worked on connecting around what wasn't working or what they were dissatisfied about, getting clear about that, moving into a vision for what they yearned to achieve, and it was presented as a draft by the leaders, and then the leaders asked for feedback, they gave them feedback, and then the leaders went away and worked on Saturday. So you had one half of the group work on D and V on the 2 days, the other half of the group work on the D and the V on the other 2 days, and then on Saturday the leaders came in, rewrote the strategy, the V, and then presented it. That's where they got the standing ovation, and then they went to the F, the first steps, getting immediately to work and work at their back home units. Would you add anything to that?
No, I'm just feeling stressed. I just had a life flash before my eyes kind of moment. I'm thinking about all the events where I've done that. Man, is that a pressure-packed kind of situation. I was at one event, it wasn't not Richmond Savings, where somebody said, "Did we get it?" And there was crickets. That's another conversation, though. Nope, I don't have anything else to add. That was great.
Okay. And so could you share or maybe I'm going to pull it up, Ron, in terms of time. And I know we're getting ready, but I'm just going to pull this up and see if there might be something else you want to get into.
Do that setting the stage. Go back. That setting the stage. I really think, and this is a presentation that Paul Tulchinski originally created with Roland Loop, and it was specifically for work redesign, but then we were working on some other pieces of work, and over the years I've adapted some of these things. So I couldn't even tell you which version this is, but I do want to show, though, that you could see the seeds of what I was talking about with leaders versus change recipients in just the way Kathy operated. And so this piece right here, where we put employees want to be heard, they want to have a voice, it's just putting yourself in their shoes. And then having the employees put themselves in the leader's shoes, and vice versa. That's when everyone knows, when everyone knows. To me, this is the seeds of how I do my work now. So I haven't looked at the slide in a while, so that was interesting for me to see. If you could flash forward, though, I think 2 or 3 slides later is the principles. Keep going. Hello. Next slide, please, where it says whole scale.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was on mute. What I was saying is, I was asking you if there's anything on this that you wanted to add. On this one here, I like this in terms of, it goes back to your point about change agents and change recipients and leaders, and really kind of thinking about how you got to engage the leaders and get clear with them about what they want, and then get them open to then engaging the organization in a different way. And if the leaders are willing to craft a strategy and say, this is my best thinking, but this is not done. I need you to make it better. I need you to be a part of this, and invite them into the experience. And they got to be open to that. And when they say, yes, I will do that, then they've got to pick a design team, a representative sample group, that then helps to design the event to help the organization come together to then align around that. Now, the boundaries and guidelines, I love something that Root Learning uses and Jim Howden uses, he calls, he refers to there are firm lines, things that are there's no negotiating, these are gonna happen, these changes are in place, or these things can't be changed, but these are the firm lines, these are the guidelines, and these are no lines. And being clear about those three so that you know what people can give input on, what they can participate in, and figure out how to interact with. So I think these three phases really complement what you're talking about, your Venn diagram, as well as this notion of the guidelines that Howden had. I just wanted to kind of touch on that.
Well, yeah, I have two reactions to that. Everybody knows the leadership alignment piece and the organization alignment piece. I think when Paul Tulchinski and Roland Loop were sort of leading the charge when we were back in Dannemiller of the camp of it's, what happens after the event is just as important, if not more important, than what happens at the event. And so we used to call that continuation. And then I met Rick Fenwick, who you now know, and Rick's got a different process, very different from root learning, though it seems similar. And from a practice standpoint, it might be. But the principles that underlie how they do their work and how Rick does his work really opened my eyes to a much better way of taking leaders and organizations after they've shifted and provide a structure, really. Again, that's why I said your S in the DVS, a structure to allow the change to continue to grow and the momentum to actually build rather than dissipate.
Cool. And then the next slide
that's
here.
That's an entire another webinar, though, Rick's whole process.
Yeah, it is.
Because he did that as his doctoral dissertation work about 15 years, 20 years ago, but it's also a practitioner model as well. So it's something else.
Yeah. And then here are the whole scale principles.
Yeah, this one's interesting for me. As I think about this, I think about Jake. Jake's really big into, he's got his RTSC principles, and he's really updated those. And as I'm just looking at these, I'm curious to see if I had to make a list of principles that I use right now, would these be the same? I mean, I definitely embody these at this point in how I do my work. And it's interesting to just take a look at this and how many people use these words and say, yep, I get that. Yeah, I do that. And it's that jingle jangle fallacy that I learned about when I was doing my dissertation work way back Thorndike at the turn of the century, 1904, talking about how people have way different meanings for the same word. So that word purpose, for example, the way Kathy described purpose and the way some Harvard expert change consultants describe purpose might sound similar, but when you see it in action, it couldn't be more different. And to me, it is really, I used to use the term operationalize. I don't think it's a word, but how do you operationalize these principles? And that's really where you continue to give value. And Steve, that's why even in some of the work that you and I have done in the last year, I've struggled with the language. Kathy used to always say, trust the process. And to me, it's just like, trust the principles, because if we use these principles, no matter what kind of project we're on, it's going to work.
Yeah, right on. That's very well said. And John, anything going on out there?
And you can use these principles and never do a single large group meeting and still have a very successful transformational change effort.
Right.
But again, that's a whole nother, yet another webinar.
Yeah, we got lots we could talk about. Unpacking this can be a lot. So could you speak to this process here?
I mean, this was just a general template. Paul used to use this, I believe, with he's got a whole-scale work redesign roadmap, and again, he was leading the charge of it's not about the events, it's the the 3, 6, 9 months or a year before. There's a shift that happens, and then there's the work that needs to happen afterwards. And those of us who were not in the camp of, oh, we're only there just to do the events, really like that. And so I remember Roland and I, and I'm sure there were other folks too, that said, hey, let's take what Paul was doing with the work redesign and think about how we do strategy work, which was a main service that we were doing at that time. And so this was it. This was,
yeah.
And another cut at this was just taking Ron Lippett's got an old 12-step process that really, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking of his process was the roots of this, and I'm pretty sure it's in the whole scale book. I actually scanned it in. I can get a link to it. I'll make a note to myself. We'll put that in the follow-up.
Okay, cool. And so here, what I want to focus on is the square at the center is the actual large group event, and that they had, and that's where they had 2 days on D&V, Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday and Friday on D&V with the other half of the organization. They split it to 2, and then on Saturday, the leadership met. They went over the strategy, which is the V, the strategic planning document, the mission, vision, goals, and principles and targets. And they got clear about that on Saturday, and then they came back on Sunday, presented it, asked the question, did we get it? Got a standing ovation, broke up into their groups, and went to work on the first steps, the F. That has to be greater than the resistance to change to create real change in the organization. There's also the MCG. Could you talk a little bit about MCG?
Yeah, MCG was taking Jack Gibbs' work on trust back in the 70s, and interestingly, Daryl Conner used to hang a lot with Jack back then, and so Daryl's work really dovetails with this, and there's lots of cool similarities between Dan and Miller's work and Daryl's work that I've been lucky enough to explore with Daryl in the last 5 years since I've become friends with him. But as you think about Jack's work and the trust, Art Lerner and part of Kathy's core group with Al Davenport and Bruce Gibb and Nancy Bedore, they would meet like once a month or once every other month and just talk about their practices and theories and how to teach what it is that they're doing. And Art wrote a great article, it was probably 6 or 7 pages, where he took Jack's work and described how it is that Kathy, Art, and the whole gang back then was doing work with teams of people as they're going through these initiatives. And MCG just stood for Membership Control Goals. Just a real, Susan Grechko likes to say that Kathy's, what she calls dime store models. It's yet another one of Kathy's dime store models, and Susan's used this with, we're talking billion-dollar companies, the CEOs and heads and whatnot, and she says these dime store models work just as well with them as they do with somebody at an automotive plant. So to me, MCG is just real quick membership control goals. It's really, to me, not that much different than something, let's say, forming, norming, storming, performing. It's what I do like about it, though, is it's non-linear because it's a circular model. And as you know, that's a drum that I've been beating loudly and will continue to beat forever, is that the difference between linear models and non-linear models is huge. I would hands down use MCG over forming, norming, storming, performing any day of the week.
And explain how can you define each of those and how you would apply it?
Well, how Kathy described MCG was it continues to iterate. She didn't use that word. She just would say it would continue to cycle. And some teams cycle upwards and some teams cycle downwards. And it's a great way of taking a look at, okay, if you're, think about a team you're working with, a project team, think about month one. Well, who am I? Who's here? We're all sort of getting to know each other. We're getting things done. Those are the goals. Well, somebody's telling us to get those things done. That's the control. And then as people know more, some people take on more work, take on more of a role with the team and what they're doing. Some take on less of a role. Some people come and go. And every time somebody leaves, or you're down a person or up a person, it's time to revisit. Okay, let's make sure we're still clear on who's doing what and why is everybody here. How often do you go to meetings where you have no idea why somebody's there, and the meeting started and it ended, and it's like, who is that? And I mean, that happens in certain organizations. I doubt it happens with you, Steve, because you'd be asking them. I know you. But in a lot of other organizations that don't have Steve in their meetings, that goes on, and right away that's a membership issue, and it stays unresolved, and it gets in the way of good team performance.
Right on. So the DVFR, or DVFSR, is one. Critical mass, having a critical mass in the room that connect around the DVF, that agree on the D, agree on the V, agree on the F. If you get enough people agreeing on it and connecting on it, you're going to create the tipping point, or that paradigm shift. MCG, being mindful of the membership, control, and goals. Also during the event, there's people getting input on the strategy, having input into the strategic plan, like you saw at Richmond Savings, where they had input on it on that second day, and then the leaders revised it and brought it back on that Sunday, and then you had everybody but 5 show up because they were so vested in finding out how their voice came out in the revised strategy. And then you got action planning, the F, moving to action in the short term, in the very short term, the next week to next 2 months. What kind of actions can we move on so we make significant progress on our vision that we have? So you got that as the heart, and that's the during the event. And before that, you can see all the stuff from the scoping, and an event planning team, and then the leadership meets and they have their work. And an event planning team is a representative sample of that leadership that helps design that flows into small group work and flows into another event planning team that the leadership team picks. And that event planning team is picked to be a representative sample of the whole, and they design the logistics for the event, and they determine the facilities, how to invite people to come, who needs to speak, and they create a logistics team to really run things during the event. And you have to finalize the design, and then you have your event, and then you have your post-event work, and then you got purposeful work around the specific actions, which flow into small group work. So you have small project teams working on the specific first step actions that have been identified. Leaders are having to work to support that small group work and support their work to create the conditions for success. So you got leaders doing their work, you got teams doing their work, and then you got a reunion checkpoint. You get an event planning team for that, a representative group of the whole that's going to be at the checkpoint. And at the checkpoint, you review the commitments that you made, assess your progress, learn from what has happened, celebrate your success, decide what needs to happen next, and so forth. And that moves back into small group work, which gets at the notion of converge, diverge. Could you speak a little bit to the converge, diverge notion?
Yeah, I just want to say, too, that this is only for Richmond Savings. That if you try to use this with another, even a bank, let's say, I forgot to tell you too, Steve, I did work with the second largest community bank in Michigan and remade the Richmond Savings video, but for this bank and the initiative. We did it in like 2007 or 8, but the guy I did it with got really mad that Rick and I went into business together, so thus you haven't really seen me show it, but that'll be something in between this webinar and the next webinar that we'll have to take a look at too. But in terms of the converge diverge, it is when do we need to have consensus, for example. Consensus is more people, right? It's not just you and me making an agreement. It's getting a whole team or group or organization of people, and it takes time. There's pros and cons to consensus. And there are times when you need consensus, and it does take time. And there are times where you need to split things up and be efficient. like I'm sure Jake would look at it as an effectiveness and efficiency polars, or in polarity management talk. So it's just a constant tension going back and forth between when do we need to consent and converge, but when do we need to get really creative thinking? Because if you think back to good, let's say, groupthink theory, for example, if you're constantly converging, you're going to run into groupthink. And so you need divergence. And again, I'd like to see if Jake's got a polarity map on this, because I think that'd be a great way to explain that too.
Yeah. And so for everybody out there, we're getting close to wrapping up. We just have a few more minutes, and what I want to emphasize is that in terms of the little step model, we have anticipation, which is off of this slide. You have anticipation for this particular experience happening, the strategy, development, implementation roadmap. Anticipation of that, and then you have after this leveraging of this. Now in this, you've got the before, which is the scoping, the leadership team alignment, small group work. Now you got also the event planning team before any of those squares. So you got the scoping, event planning team, leadership alignment, small group work, event planning team, small group work as you get ready for the big event, okay? And then so right there up to the small group work, that's the before. The during is the organization alignment event, and then after you've got special purpose work, small group work, leadership work, and reunion checkpoint and small group work that flow out of it. And the converge diverge is that when you come into these squares, it's a convergence of people. It's an event where people converge, and then they diverge out to do work. And then they converge back in at the reunion checkpoint, and they converge back out to do work. And within that, you get a lot of converging of small teams and groups that converge to create consensus around what they're going to work on, and then they move back out. So lots of convergence and divergence is going on. And,
hey, Steve,
yeah.
On the chat room, Maggie had a question about how is Richmond Savings doing now, which I think is a great question. And the way I'd answer that is the way I think Kathy would. What I heard her say time and again was that an initiative like this, the organization's like a piano, and she came in and she helped them get it tuned. And it was at the checkpoint, that's when you found out it's in tune, and it's staying in tune so far. I mean, there's a little bit, it's getting a little bit out of tune. Kathy used to say a lot, like one of her dime store 3 things on the checkpoint was, what did we say we're going to do, what did we do, and why the gap? And it was
and Richmond Savings, the fast forward is, if I remember correctly, they merged, I believe, with another bank. There were some mergers, and they merged after that. They achieved all of the goals, both sets of goals, the straw dog goals and the next generation event goals. They achieved all of that within 2 years, way ahead of schedule. And they, I think, merged. The president passed away from a heart attack unexpectedly somewhere in that 2-year time period as well.
So my answer would be is that it's nearly impossible to sustain that without going back and doing good ongoing work. And so, I'll find out. I highly doubt that, especially, man, with a merger integration, forget about it. Those are awful. And I would say that, she, just like a piano tuner, you get in there, you tune it, and it's a matter of retuning. And how often does it need to retune? And a lot of these things, again, back to Steve's original slide, is transformation. Things die, and then there's a rebirth. And nothing's ever, I don't think anything's meant to go on like this year after year after year after year. I don't think that's possible with human beings in our world.
Yeah, thanks. And so as we look at here, we talked about the already convergence and divergence. and how you converge at the event, you diverge out, and you go do your work. And we talked about this model. And like you said, you can tune the piano, and you can have mergers. You have all kinds of stuff happening. The one thing is for certain: people converge. They walk in a room, or they connect. They come together, and they say, "What's going on?" And then they make a decision of some kind, healthily or unhealthily or dysfunctionally or functionally or whatever. But they somehow and they get back out, and they go back out and go to work, and they come back together. And sometimes when they come back together, they are great transformative experiences, and sometimes they are very bad experiences that take people backwards. And the principles of this work, the principles of good collaboration, I'm working on a book called Circles and Squares, which talks about the notion of aisles and rows and aisles, and people coming to meetings and sitting in rows and aisles and being told what's going to happen, or in classrooms, and how the real work is collaborative. It's circles. It's bringing people together to have conversation and dialogue, and that's where those questions of what's the purpose, who needs to be involved, and what conversations need to take place are so powerful. Tattooing on one hand purpose and on the other hand conversation, and making sure the who and making sure the circle gets bigger and bigger is really key. And so we got convergence, and our work is going to be always to continue to create rhythms based on good principles that build healthy collaborative process. And it just doesn't always happen that way, but it's an aspiration that we should all always have. And we're going to come back again, Ron. This is the second video where Kathy, you interview Kathy, and she talks about it. We'll come back and have this and discuss this and so forth. Are there any other questions or comments out there from the audience and people that are here today?
Hey, Kathy and Stosh. Kathy and Stosh, because Stosh's contribution was invaluable.
Thank you. Okay, and Stosh. And you interviewed both of them actually in this, and more people than just that. You brought it to life.
Right, Al Blix and Kathy really wanted to just reflect on it, and this is speaking to primarily to OD and change agents, but it's I think it's good. It's we're thinking now it's like a reflection piece.
Yeah, and then
because unfortunately I don't love the original video as much as you do, and so I tend to not watch it. Some of my clients said it was dated some years ago, so that's when I made that update. And yeah. I don't often show it, but I really think this one where Kathy and Stosh are reflecting, I think that's a timeless teaching tool.
Yeah. And so in closing, there's more backup. There's materials here. We can come back together and even talk about the designing the actual agenda and the detail that goes into the different activities. And there's a whole lot that goes into that. There's handouts that have to be designed to make sure these events, the activities that are facilitated where the groups sitting at the table self-facilitate, they don't get facilitated by someone. If handouts are designed well, and if the activities are designed with a good design team, you can create conditions where people can self-facilitate in 300 to 3,000 people. And yeah, go ahead.
If you find any typos in the handouts, I'd like to know so I could let the ISTJ Jim Manilakis know. Mr. Logistics Czar, I'd love to see some kind of typo that he did 20 years ago and be able to point it out to him at dinner.
Great. And are there any of these results you want to talk to as we say goodbye about the results of this? This is like you said, it's more than a feel good. It's more than heart. It's head and heart, and it's moving to action and results. Any of these that you want to speak to as we wrap up?
No, not really. To tell you the truth, I'd rather just stay with what you were saying with Richmond, which is the different lists that they had, what the typical business initiatives. That's what we see today. So that column one that you showed, that is 2015 all over again, or 1994 all over again in 2015, which is we've got tons of people trying to push all this, I don't know, technical jargon type language, and it doesn't speak to people. And so going back to what speaks to people, well, who are these people? Let's stop trying to suck up to the leaders so much at the expense of the change recipients. Because I'll point to the Orig, Koller, and Armenicus 2011 60-year review of commitment to organizational change, where they say the success or failure of these initiatives comes down to how the change recipients react to the change. So at the end of the day, if we do some kind of stakeholder analysis and we do it all upward analyses and it's all about power, we're falling into that trap. We're reinforcing the fact that leaders are somehow more important when the research shows that it's the opposite. Obviously, leadership is important, but it's a stimulus response kind of thing. It's a system. The leaders lead, and the employees respond. I mean, it's a two-part thing. Don't try and dissect it down into the smallest linear part. It's a holistic, nonlinear system that's working, even when it's two people, even when it's a single leader and a single employee. It's got to match both. It's got to balance both of those perspectives. And unfortunately, today, 2015, those are really out of balance.
Well, Ron, thank you for your time.
Yeah, so even 21 years later, this is still a great lesson.
It is. Super. And thank you for taking the time to share this with us. And for everybody out there, are there any checking out points? What's your takeaway? If you could, in the chat room on GoToWebinar or in the chat room on Chatsy, just what's your takeaway from today's session? And John, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I'll do this real quick. And there is one question from Beatrice. This was a while ago, though. And Ron, you said a couple times today, that's another webinar in and of itself. But she asks, sometimes our clients are not sure of what they want and ask for things that won't work or that they think might not work. How do you help handle that? So what are some tools I'm thinking that you use to talk with the client to?
Well, I gotta be perfectly honest with you. And Steve saw me do this recently. I am all about taking the client where they're at. That was a phrase that Kathy used a lot. And so what often happens is I'll take them where they're at. I'll do a proposal for what they say they want to do, whether that's what I think it is the right step or not. So let's say I want them to do some kind of big nonlinear change intervention, and they say, no, we just want a little linear stakeholder analysis. Well, do I take that work and try and get them to shift and move, take them where they're at? I mean, there's a little bit of negotiation that goes on. I can only get so much. But a lot of times I will almost never have, here's exactly what we did, line up 100% with here's what the proposal said we were going to do. Now I know that's not everybody, and other people might be different, but that was something I especially learned from Paul Tolchinsky because of the twists and the turns of process and organizational design and all the politics that go along with that. In fact, that's another. Actually, I would recommend to Beatrice Bob Marshak's book, Covert Processes at Work. It doesn't completely hit the mark, but it really talks at here's the issues we need to be focusing on with those people, because we're talking about the wrong stuff. We're talking about things like stakeholder analysis when we need to be talking about whose voice matters and the power balance or imbalance, and are people empowered or disempowered, and why. Those are the kinds of conversations, and I think we're our own worst enemy, because as change agents, we've let some people get their hands on the wheel and kind of hijack it, and it's not the right conversations.
I would add two things. I'd add two things to that. One is I think of it as a tank full and empty, and meeting them where they are is going to, if they're 1/4 tank full versus where I want them to be, which is totally full, I might meet them where they are and just think about how can I move the tank a little bit more full, move the needle just a little bit with them, stretch them a little bit. And I think that's important in terms of meeting with them. I think the other thing that works well is really being purposeful and really getting them to be clear about purpose and outcomes, and then helping them see ways of achieving that purpose and outcomes more collaboratively. and just again doing what they want, yet finding ways to include the right people, finding ways to ask different questions. And like Ron and you and I in our current project, we're constantly figuring out different ways we can expand the circle, different ways we can get people included, different ways we can do that, because we know that that's going to help them achieve their outcomes that they want to achieve, and still staying within their comfort zone, but pushing them a little bit beyond at times. John, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I had to mute myself because of Charles, but I was going to ask you to chime in, but you did, and talking about pushing the needle. I don't have anything yet, only because I lost what I was going to say. Sorry.
Okay.
I know what I was going to say. I was going to say, it's interesting, Ron, that you brought up Bob Marshak, because we just did our Dialogic OD webinar with him and Jervis last week. And so we're going to be doing some community building with everyone here and with the larger Nexus community on keeping that discussion going and just reflecting on a lot of the things that we talked about today.
I'm glad you guys are doing that. I wish you talked more about, I've seen the Dialogic stuff and I've seen Jervis out in Vancouver, but I'd really, if you can get him to go back to what he was thinking about, because his intent with that covert processes at work was Shine Process Consultation Volume 3. And I think he did an admirable job, and I wish more people talked about it. I think that's what we need. We need to be talking about the content that Bob has in that book. So I'm glad you're doing that, Steve.
Yeah. And we're going to use Maestro Conference for that. So it'll be engaging, and people will be able to break everybody into small groups and take some deep dives. I think it'll be a very worthwhile cohort project.
Cool.
Yeah.
Are there any
kind of dissertation help over the last few years? If I would email him a question, he'd email me right back. He's a real nice guy.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and most people in our line of work really help each other in so many ways. So, John, are there any other checkout comments from the chat room?
Yeah, Maggie said to keep the conversation going, getting change recipients involved. She thought the hierarchy and patriarchy was supposed to be gone by now. Too much technical and no social. We all need to understand the value of socio-technical systems. I think that's what she meant by SDS. Miguel said, thank you very much for holding this webinar. And I would just say my key takeaway was it's how the change recipients feel about the work. So just that distinction of the three leaders, change agents, and change recipients, and then it really is how they, what their takeaways are from the change process or from the progress process.
Yeah, all three, I think, too, because you may have heard the way I've said it is because they've been so neglected. I want to make sure it's all three need to be aligned and important. They just seem to be the voice that's not being heard right now.
Great. And so we wrap up. John, is there anything else you want to share as we check out? We've got a LinkedIn follow-up discussion. There'll be a survey, and we got the next upcoming sessions.
The next session is June 22nd. Emails will be coming out Monday, and that is for a conversation with the founder of Maestro Conference. And so that will be actually our first of 4 Maestro Conference sessions that we'll be doing this summer. And that will be coming out on Monday. So make sure you sign up.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you. Ron, thank you. Everybody out there, thank you. We are done for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.